please join me in welcoming Keith McCammon.
Thank you very much. All right. Thank you all. Thank you very much to the entire MITRE team for having us here. It's been a super fun event. I've had a ton of fun just kind of meeting and getting to know folks over the last couple days and having a bunch of good discussions. So, so following the last talk, this will be effectively like your freshman level like introduction to data sources, right? So the stuff that you just saw will definitely is super useful for digging into a lot of the nits that you encounter and like some of the really hard operational challenges that relates to dealing with data sources. But I'm going to bring it up a little bit. And so I'm Keith. Nice to meet those of you I haven't met, and hello to everyone at home. Going to, by way of like background introduction, like I've been at this for around 20 years, I guess, like in the security industry. And as I was like preparing for my talk this morning, which means I was reading Twitter, I came across a tweet from Jeremiah Grossman. So if you don't know him, he's more useful to follow than I am, or pretty much anybody else. So he had some really interesting thoughts, and he kind of posed a question this morning, which just like literally as I pulled up the app, sitting there in front of me and really resonated. And like the question he asked was, if there was one thing you wish you knew, or like a piece of advice, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you wish you had gotten when you got into InfoSec, what was it, right? And he provided a couple of answers of his own. One of those was to focus a little bit less on what's possible and really think through like what's probable, right? And that really resonated, right? It's really, really easy, particularly if you've done work for the government or other places like that, right? You know what's possible, right? And a lot of these things have become public knowledge now. So now we have a really great appreciation for like what really, really high-end like adversary tools and techniques in tradecraft look like. And it's really easy to get mired in like, okay, if I go do these things, like there's still someone that's going to beat me, right? If that's your threat model, like you can rest pretty much assured that someone's always going to beat you. So like just trying to think through how to get started, right? And when I thought about like what we're here to like talk about and learn and share, a lot of it, just for like a little bit of context, like as we've gone through the last couple of years trying to help like build a community around attack, right? As practitioners, as just community builders in general, trying to think through like how do we take this like massive body of knowledge and make it really approachable for people, right? How do we figure out how to get started? More so than anything else, right? Like the subtext behind this, and I think the point of like hopefully the next 20 or so minutes is like it's for people who are trying to figure out how to get started. How do you take this body of knowledge that we've now compiled, like this taxonomy we have for describing the things that attackers like want, and then like the ways that they go to get them. And how do you dip your toe in? What's one of the first things you can do, right? And so thinking through this in the context of detection engineering, right, which is like not the focus of the talk, but is a really interesting way to think through like how you go from data sources to operational detection, is you have these like 3 things you need to do, right? You need to make sure you're collecting the right data, first and foremost. Having worked for many of these decades, or for a couple decades now, alongside some folks doing really, really great like forensics work in addition to security operations and other things. Like a principle, or I guess a phrase that's always stuck with me is like you can't go back in time to collect evidence, right? See Richard sitting out here, who is like a kind of pioneer of thinking of things like not waiting until you need data to go try to find it, right? Collect as much as you can, as early as you can. And so there's a balance you have to strike there, right? Once you collect that data, then you need to like ask the right questions of it. This is where like the work that we're doing inside of ATT&CKcon is really, really valuable, right? What questions might I need to ask? What are the things that adversaries are going to do so that I can go formulate questions to ask in my data set? And then you have to be able to answer those questions, right? So if you've ever bought a product and you kind of turn detection all the way up to 11, and now you turn on the MITRE ATT&CK feed, that's awesome, right? So like you've got exceptional visibility maybe, But now you've got 10,000 questions that you need to go answer. And for most teams, that's not achievable either, right? And so, again, striking some balance. What does this have to do with attack? Heat maps. There's a lot of fixation on measuring detection. If we've proved anything as an industry, at least for as long as I've been in it, it's that objectively measuring detection, protection, prevention, however you want to think about it, is exceptionally difficult, right? These things are very context-based. Detecting a thing or observing a thing in one environment doesn't necessarily correlate in terms of like scope, impact, severity when you look across a whole bunch of them, right? So we love to fixate on measuring detection, building heat maps, things like that, and they're valuable for some purposes. It's very, very easy to skip over some of the fundamentals, which are like, am I collecting the right data? And particularly for those of you getting started, right? If you're trying to think through defending an enterprise for the first time, whether it's because you're new to the industry or because like you're a team of one trying to build a security program in a company that doesn't have one, right? Trying to take that first step can be like a little bit daunting, right? So can't detect things that we can't see, right? Observability like comes before everything else. If you think through like asking questions of your data and then being able to answer those questions, if you don't have the right data to begin with, like everything else is moot, right? So specific to attack data sources, like those are really, really useful for a couple particular things. Like there's a bunch of use cases, but I think the two that I always come back to are being able to assign value like objectively to data and therefore to like tools and solutions that you implement. And then measuring progress and coverage, right? If there's one heat map to rule them all that I think is like exceptionally useful as a way for people to think about how they're making progress in their program and whether they're spending money on solution implementation tools, what have you, in the right way, it's that like you want to make sure that like above all else, like coverage continues to improve like in a thoughtful way, right? Again, like asking questions of data, operationalizing that coverage can be challenging to various degrees and at various points in time to like different folks in different organizations. But making sure that you're thoughtfully collecting the right data, that you understand that cost and that you understand those trade-offs first and foremost is really valuable, right? So a couple obligatory nods here. I'll start with the ones not listed, which is like the entire team at Red Canary, right? So who've done like and continue to do like most of the great work that kind of guides my thinking about this stuff. Olaf and the Rodriguez brothers, right, is like just a couple of things that I've used, like resources, people I've like followed, work that I've really enjoyed following over time. And specific to this, like things that I used to help think through like other ways to look at or value data sources, right? And obviously the attack team for like putting this all together, right? So I use these words in the title, which seemed like a really neat idea when I think we like spent a half hour or so coming up with a title for this talk months ago. And now I'm backed into having to find this thing. So this is a pretty open-ended concept, right? So like this is not the point of the talk. But going back to how you get started, right? And the context of like Jeremiah's question and the answer that he provided this morning. It's just being in a position to detect most threats most of the time, right? This is not where your program wants to end up, right? I'm not suggesting that you go figure out how to detect 80% of things and then declare victory. But I am suggesting that like this is a really, really useful way to get started, right? And a really, really useful like forcing function for building a solid foundation for your program. So extending that a little bit, like a few principles that I like wanted to lay out and just kind of like as we talk through like some of the more mechanical pieces of this, these three things are kind of like the guides that I keep in my brain all the time and the words that I try to remind myself as I'm thinking through, hey, it would be really, really neat to go off and like do this thing. Like, does it maximize coverage, right? So again, like thinking through like the one heat map that I always come back to in my brain, which is like, do I have visibility into a greater percentage of techniques than I had yesterday, right? Just from like an engineering perspective. Minimize complexity, right? Again, this is like probably not the talk for those of you working at like an institution that has a huge team and 100 tools. This is the talk for those of you who have a small team, you're under-resourced, you're trying to figure out how to move the needle, right? And again, like take that first step, build a solid foundation, and build some great momentum. And optimize for answers, right? So at every step along the way, as you're going and starting to hoard more data, that's awesome. As you go and formulate analytics to apply to that data, which is also a great exercise to go through. Like at the end of the day, like there is a huge gap between just having like great analytic coverage and doing detection, which is that you need to figure out like which of those questions you've asked, which of those investigative leads you've created, which of those things matter. Which of them matter, right? And like there might be 100 that matter, but there might be 10 of that 100 that matter a lot more than the rest. And you had better get good at figuring out how to get from point A to point B if you want to achieve good outcomes. So like these three things, as we talk through the rest, just kind of keep in mind. So kind of glanced over the slide. The data sources really is like the linchpin of attack, right? Again, without these, everything else that we want to do with this fantastic framework is kind of like, it's a secondary discussion, right? So I had to jam these in at the last minute, and I think like these continue to change every time. As the Rodriguez brothers were giving their talk, I had like a little moment of panic that I got the numbers completely wrong. It turns out today I'm only off by one. These are 48 hours or 72 hours old. So the numbers aside, right? And I think there's great tools now for going and interrogating this data. But like 59 data sources, and this is just an enterprise attack, right? That span the 266 techniques. I'm assuming the website's right, and I'm not. So useful for understanding how we observe a given technique. That's the purpose, right? There are some like nits once you get into this, and I think like the fantastic tools that you'll see in Hunter's Forge, places like that, are extremely useful. Like as I was kind of watching that talk, like those are the ways you want to go address these nits once you get into operation, right? Do you need one or all data sources to properly observe a technique, right? Windows event logs are a really, really good example, right? You may only need one of the 10 data sources inside of your environment to observe that technique in a way that informs you well enough to develop an analytic and ultimately get to an answer, right, to perform detection. And they're not clearly defined, which is also fine, right? One of the things, like one of the principles is to minimize complexity. And when you look at all of the work that goes into attack, refining and continuing to evolve this matrix and this body of knowledge, it's not super important that we have these things perfectly defined. What is important is that they're there and that we think about them, right? So now let's talk about where we start, right? There are kind of four ways. There's this progression that I think I've at least gone through. This has been my mental journey, and I know many of the folks on my team and a few others that I've talked to this week. These are the four steps that are really high level, right? Understand prevalence, right? So just which things occur most often. Then focus on a class of data or product, right? And this is one where if you're just getting started, maybe the decision's a little bit easier. Once you get farther into your program, now you're trying to close gaps, you can go through this iteratively, right? Your decision the first time you go through this process may be completely different from the decision or the conclusions or the weighting that you assign to these data sources second, third, fourth time, right? Then you're going to differentiate within a class of product, and then you're going to overlay what we know, things we've heard about, and I'm going to kind of skip over the intel parts of this, but we've done a really good job, I think, of helping everyone understand why it's so important that we share operational data and insights so that folks, whether you're just getting started or whether you're trying to close those gaps, right, go from 80 to 85% to 90 to 100, wherever you are, it's super important to be able to overlay some operational context and understand how and why these things happen in the real world. So understanding prevalence is simple. This wouldn't be a con talk if there wasn't a typo. So Hunter's Forge, not Hunter's Force, which thankfully you spent the last half hour hearing about. I I think this is a pretty dope name. It's just like a little more superhero than it is like Lord of the Rings. But at any rate, this tool is like only providing this because it was a tool that I came up with some time ago just to answer some of these questions for myself. So not going to spend any time on it. I use it to make numbers. You need to be able to recreate those numbers so you have some confidence I'm not lying in the end. So top data sources by prevalence, right? And I think there's already been a good bit of discussion about this the last couple days, right? But this is it, right? So these are the top 10 data sources in the attack data set, or in the enterprise attack data set as it exists today or 72 hours ago. I'm assuming they haven't changed like much in that time. That's pretty straightforward, right? So now let's think about like how we take that and focus on a class of data or product, right? I tried to group these data sources like very notionally based on like the types of devices, collection platforms they'll come from, right? So you've got some endpoint, you've got some network, you have some things that can come from either, right? Think NetFlow and stuff like that, and like that's really down to like how much, like what type of coverage you're after. We now have cloud as of a few days ago, which was like the first pass at screwing up all the numbers I had put together for this deck. And then you have other. So these are things like mail server logs, web server logs. They're specific to types of applications. They're materially useful inside of the data set, particularly depending on the techniques that you care about. But taking those and just understanding at a really high level, like what types of things am I going to collect data from so that I know what solutions I need to move this needle forward, right? Then if you just take that top 10 that I showed you and look at where those come from, like now it becomes a little bit more clear, right? And so it will come as no surprise to any of you, although having spent most of my career like packet monkeying, so to speak, spend most of my time now working with endpoint data, right? And so this is not a suggestion that you should do one or the other. Like you should absolutely do both. Again, thinking through like how you start or how you make the next step forward, right? So now let's assume, for sake of argument, like now you're digging into wanting to close this 80%, right? Now you've got to differentiate within a class of product, and this is where things start to get interesting, right? So you need some data from your endpoints, like what the heck do you do, right? You've got a couple solutions here, right? And if this is always like a super interesting conversation to have with folks that are trying to implement like any type of endpoint-based data collection for the first time. Which of the things that's available to you do you start with, right? And there are tons of choices, right? There's open source stuff, right? You've got Sysmon, you've got all these other providers on Mac OS, Linux, things like that, right? You've got a variety of ways to get data off endpoints. Then you've got commercial products. And so in thinking through like how to process that for purposes of making an initial decision, have found it useful to just bucket them into one of two categories, right? There are solutions that are visibility first, meaning that they are optimized for collecting data consistently, right? Meaning that these data types here that are filled in, they're optimized for collecting that data all the time. On the other side of that, you have like protection first solutions, right? So these are things, their first job is to defend the endpoint. They also try to account for collection of data that's useful for hunting and investigation and things like that. But that's not their primary purpose in life. Like their primary purpose in life is to like prevent bad things from happening first and foremost. Then they're fulfilling these investigative, threat hunting, detection, investigation use cases secondarily, right? And so that's cute and that's a neat picture, but now you've got to figure out like the point of this is to like put some data behind this, right? So to give you some objective basis for making a decision. And so the way that I ended up doing this was just to say, all right, like for a visibility solution, which could be a commercial solution, it could be something like Sysmon modular, right, where you can just take the thing that you already have in a Windows environment, apply a config to it, flip it on, enumerate the data types that are collected always from most of the products or solutions like in those buckets, right? You can see here, like for visibility solutions, Again, open source or commercial, like these tend to be like the data types that you're going to get very consistently, assuming you don't monkey with the configuration. On the protection side, they do the thing, like if you think about like the data sources at the top of the list, right? They very clearly optimize for collecting those all of the time. You will absolutely get other types of data from them, but you're going to get it selectively, right? Those agents are going to try to decide when a process or a behavior is interesting, and then they're going to provide you with additional data in those cases, right? And so this tool to look at that just makes it easy to measure this in some way, right? So if you take those like EDR data sources as effectively like protection, right? Meaning effectively like any product you buy to do endpoint protection that also does some data collection is going to give you process monitoring and process command line monitoring, right? Like those are the two common data elements. That gets you 70%, right? Like that's pretty freaking good from going from nothing to something. Like being able to cover down on 70% just by throwing almost any product out there that attempts to meet these use cases is super valuable. Work heavily with CB response. This is not a product talk, but like that gets you up over 80, right? That's awesome. For the first time, like literally just a few days ago, I was like, all right, I'll take a look at Sysbon Modular. We'll dig into that. We'll enumerate the data sources that provides consistently, 85% almost, right? Like 84, 85%. For something that costs you nothing, right? Other than just your time to turn it on. Again, not talking about building analytics. We're not talking about operations, investigation, and the end state of detection. We're just trying to figure out which of these things moves the data, moves the needle on collecting data that the attack matrix says might be useful, right? Observations, putting ourselves in a position to observe the things that matter. So that's a kind of just, again, like we're 3/4 of the way through this. The last piece is the piece I think that you've heard a lot about, right? So that's just overlaying the operational context. So while it's neat to build a great foundation and to know that you're collecting the right data, and while it's neat to have some objective basis for like assigning value to that data or helping you make a implementation decision, now you've got to take advantage of the things that we learn as a community from putting this into practice, right? For the folks that have gone and like built analytics on top of this and have gone through the exercise of going from asking thousands of questions of this data set to finding the handful of things that matter and you need to respond to. Like taking that operational context and overlaying it, right? Like this was shown yesterday by John, but like this is just like this is the top 10 from our report last year, right? Which is just showing like having a team that's built thousands of analytics for this stuff, looking at all those things, answering those questions, like is it bad, is it not, and then escalating it to an enterprise so that they can respond. Like these are the top 10 just based on prevalence, right? And so now when you apply this, you take this and you kind of overlay it with the data source prevalence information. Like now you can start to make some of those really hard decisions with respect to like features or functionality of tools, or because you can't afford to collect everything. Like not everyone can afford to take Sysbon Modular and just turn the thing on and assume that you can operationalize that, right? You're going to make trade-offs. Security and risk management, for those of you who are new to it, like welcome to a career of making trade-offs, right? It's super exciting and a great like thought exercise. So, but again, just taking this stuff and trying to think through how and when you would overlay that in your decision-making process, right? And then you can start to look at trends. So I think it was asked like indirectly if we're doing the threat report again this year. Like, of course we are. It's also not to talk about that, but this is like an interesting way to think about those. And like more so than anything else, like now that MITRE is collecting the sightings data, right? For those of you who are in a position to provide sightings data, this is why this becomes critical, because like prioritizing data sources in practice is going to be different for every enterprise. How those trends change over time is going to be different, like as an industry, as an enterprise, as industry verticals, things like that, right? So, PowerShells across the board, right? Like we continue to see that. But then you look at stuff like this, right? Which is really, really interesting when you think about the implications of what you collect and how you use it, right? Windows admin shares and remote file copy in the last 12 months, just like this, right? Does anybody know who to thank for that? Emotet, right? It is like the great destroyer of enterprise in like the last 12 months. And when you think about like data sources and operationalizing those and prioritizing how you respond, like these are the things that like once you get over the hump of collecting the data that you want and figuring out what to do with it, like now you can start to take data from the community, whether it's from like reports from us or CrowdStrike or whomever. But more importantly, even just like things you learn inside of these Slack communities and by sharing information with one another like here and elsewhere, right? Applying that context. I only put this in here because I think like I walk into pretty much every threat intelligence discussion with the going in position that like it's pretty much always phishing, right? Like we can get into like the nits of like 1,000 attack techniques. How breaches happen, I think in like a lot of our minds is still like it's always phishing, which I realize is like I'm oversimplifying, but for the first time ever that took a dip down in our data set, but that's neither here nor there. So the important takeaway, right, is that like, again, just to reinforce what you've already heard, like everyone here be thinking whether it's on an individual basis, like in a Slack community or wherever, or as a program, like if you're a large enterprise and you're building analytics and have this data and have this resource, if you're a service provider, like very much like now MITRE's got the sightings program, which is ramping up. Like we have a way to do this now, and maybe for the first time ever, like we have a way to share really useful threat intelligence in a way that scales and doesn't betray privacy and things like that, and like the concerns we've had when we try to overcomplicate sharing domains and IPs and hashes, right? So everyone be thinking about how you can contribute, whether it's like thinking about new ways to prioritize data sources, assign value, getting into the details of implementing a particular data source and like the attributes of those that are interesting, or just sharing like operational data at a high level, right? Like what outcomes did you actually achieve? And again, like just kind of getting back to those principles and to kind of keep in the spirit of this, like hopefully being a like a 100-level talk at best, right? Is just maximizing coverage, try to minimize complexity whenever you can, and just keep optimizing for answers, right? And I think like a lot of the stuff that you've seen over the course of the last couple of days, and hopefully this way to think about just like data collection and the value that we assign to the data that we collect is kind of like a useful first step. That's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.